Hi folks, welcome to Intro to Poetry Week number 6. This week what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give you a shortened, a bit more concise lecture than I might have in the past, because partly what I'm going to do is The Romantics and the Americans is actually a 2-week long reading unit. So what I'm planning to do is to just record one great big battle royale of all the Romantic and early American poets we're going to read, and I'll just combine them all and do them all at once. Give you that lecture sometime next week. It should probably it's probably going to be definitely a long one, but I also feel like to some extent the Romantics and the Americans, the early Americans, are kind of like the idea that they're getting one big long massive block of classical poetry. I think that would somehow appeal to them to a degree. So the Romantics and the Americans, I'll cover this week's reading and next week's reading in the same lecture. But this week what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the Poetry Bundle 1 and also talk about the Poetry Analysis paper, because those are things you're going to be working on. The Poetry Bundle 1 is going to be due at the end of this week, and the Poetry Analysis paper is something you're going to be working on that will be due I believe right before spring break. So if we take a look at the Poetry Bundle 1 assignment, the Poetry Bundle 1 assignment is basically you're going to take at least 2 of the poems from the epic tanka or the haiku, and you're going to revise them using your critiques from your classmates as well as your own sensibilities. Basically what the poetry bundles are is the chance for you to submit revised work to me to get my feedback on it. If you haven't noticed so far, I'm not really giving you feedback on the poems, and the reason I'm not giving you feedback on the poems is because I want you to learn how to use the feedback from the peer review as opposed to just my feedback. Also because I want to kind of read things a little bit more cleaned up. So you can do you can do all 3 of the poems, but you need to do at least 2 of the poems that we've done so far. The limerick does not count because that one was in the introduction, but the epic tanka or the haiku, and then revise them using the critiques from your classmates and your sensibilities. And once you reviewed them, you submit them to me as a .doc or PDF file via this assignment, and I'll give you notes, commentary, and a grade on all the poems you submit. Okay, so turn them in. I'll go through and grade them and give you feedback same as I do in all of the other creative writing classes. And that's what we'll be doing for Poetry Bundle 1, and that needs to be submitted by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. It's not a hard assignment. Revising 2 poems is not too tricky. You've got the peer reviews under your belt, so you should be good to go for that one. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the poetry analysis paper, because that's a little bit trickier, and I kind of want to go through and just kind of give you a sense of what I'm looking for in that poetry analysis paper. So what the poetry analysis paper is really is it's an opportunity for you to practice scansion, which was something we've been working on. We were working on learning about metric poetry at the beginning of the class, but also interpreting poetry and figuring out what the meanings of poetry are by tracking down references, allusions, things along those lines. Writing poetry is generally going to require that you kind of understand the poems and also become a strong analytical reader of the poetry, and that the assignment's intended to help you kind of build those skills and get you to practice those skills, and also get you some practice scanning a poem and interpreting a poem and using that information and using your interpretations of the poem and your scanning of a poem to make literary arguments about the poem. So what we need to do, what you need to do for this assignment is you need to pick a poem written by an author we've covered in class, so it can be from something we've already studied, or another author in our text that's similar in the time period. Okay, so and the poem can't be an assigned course reading, because I go through a lot of the assigned course readings and tell you about the meanings and things like that. So you need to start with something fresh. So for in general, maybe if you're really interested in, say, Swift, you could pick one of the Swift poems we didn't read. If you're really interested perhaps in, say, Lord Byron, you could pick a Byron poem we haven't read. If you're interested in Queen Elizabeth, you might find a Queen Elizabeth poem we haven't read. Whatever you want to do, as long as it's a poem we haven't read, but it's a poem from the time periods we've covered, and also by that wasn't assigned as a course reading. So by the time we get up to actually kind of when this would be due, the time periods you can probably work from is you can probably go as far as the Romantics and the early Americans. So you can probably go up until about the year 1890 would be fine. So if you like Edgar Allan Poe, Poe is completely fine. If you want to do Emerson, Emerson's fine. If you want to do Keats, Keats is fine. All those poets are fine, and all the ones that we've read prior are fine as well. So you need to pick a poem, and then what you're going to do is you're going to scan it to determine its meter, rhythm, and how it uses rhythm and how it's using languages. Okay? And Oliver can help you with this. Use this chapters in Oliver about scanning poems to get the proper terminology, figure out what you're looking at, like we kind of did when we talked about scanning. Analyze it to find literary elements like imagery, theme, imagery, symbolism, etc. The same thing you would do when you were analyzing stories in terms of looking at the theme, looking at the imagery, how does the writing work, what are the symbols, things along those lines. So once you've got your analysis done, and you don't need to turn in the analysis to me, but this is something you need to do on your own, I want you to write a coherent, thesis-driven analysis of the poem. So it means you should have some sort of clear argument or thesis about what the poem is saying. And then it needs to identify the theme of the poem and explain what the poem is conveying to readers. So I need a sense of how the poem works and what it's saying. Describes how that form and how that language are used to express that theme. So for example, you might want to say something like the long drawn out lines in The Raven really reflect the narrator's sense that his sadness is going to be unending and just going to go on and on and on. I mean, whatever it is you want to do, but you need to make some sort of argument talking about the theme and the structure of the poem to support that point. And then you need to look at how other literary elements like symbolism, theme, imagery are used to express the theme. So basically what you're doing in this is you're going to say, this is what I believe the theme of the poem to be. This is my evidence as to why. And then you're going to talk about the structure of the poem. You're going to talk about the symbolism, the literary elements of the poem, and build a case for why the poem is doing what you say it's doing using the evidence of the poem itself. Okay, so that's kind of what we'll be working on here. The analysis should be 1,000+ words, so 250 words, and you should use MLA style to cite your references to poetic text. Poems you might want to look up in the MLA style guide because they're handled a little bit differently than text. Generally speaking, when you refer to poems, you refer to line numbers as opposed to page numbers, so you refer to the line numbers of the poems. I don't want you to use outside sources for this. This should be your own analysis of the poem, and you should analyze only one poem. In the past, I've had students who try and analyze like 4 or 5. That's not the point of this. The point of this is really close reading of one poem and really close analysis of one poem. Okay? Because a poem in and of itself can say far more than the number of words and lines it has suggests. So I really want you to take that poem, really dig into it, really analyze the meter, analyze the structure of it, really analyze what the symbolisms and themes are, and then really break it down and explain how that poem works, okay, to convey whatever the theme you're arguing is the theme of the poem. All right? And that is the poetry analysis paper. It's 100 points. There's pretty clear what I expect to see in terms of what's there. There's 75 points for the content, 25 points for the structure. If you had me for 101, 102, you know kind of how these things work. And that will be due on March 25th, which is the night before spring break. I considered having you do after spring break, but then it just drags out. And if you get it turned in before spring break, I have spring break off. I should be able to get it graded and back to you hopefully by the time you come back from spring break. So that's kind of the reason I did that. All right. So I know this is a short one. I haven't said a whole heck of a lot, but generally speaking, you've got quite a bit of work to do this week, so I would rather you spend the time getting your poetry bundle revised, critiquing the ekphrasis poem, and working on your poetry analysis paper, kind of getting a start on that, at least tracking down a poem, and then working on the Cinquain poem. And I'll dig more into the actual reading next week. As far as the Cinquain goes, the Cinquain is tossing something new into what we've been doing so far. We're bringing in some rhyme into play. So we've done syllabics. Now we're going to toss in rhyme. So it's a simple poem in kind of length, but it has a rhyme structure to it, unlike a tanka, which I kind of talk about here. There's some examples you can look at in the Cinquain form, but it's kind of a new kind of thing we're adding to the mix. In case you haven't figured out, the progression we're kind of working with so far is we're working with syllabics, so measuring the length of a poem by the number of syllables. Then we are adding in rhyme, and then we'll start looking at the rhythm of the actual like the iambic, dactylic, things like that when we start getting towards the sonnet. So it's kind of, we're just building in extra elements. And then once we've built in all the elements, then we get to more modern poetry and we kind of throw a lot of the elements out and we go to blank verse and things along those lines and then free verse. But for the most part, we're going to build up and then kind of go back down. And the reason for that arc is kind of because the more you know about using metrical poem, the better you'll be able to understand when you're not using meter, how what you're doing is poetic. All right? Okay. Also, we're kind of tracking the history of poetry this way as well. So that will be what we'll be doing for this week. Like I said, next week I will give you a really probably a lengthy lecture about the Romantics and the Americans. I might split that up by the Romantics and the Americans, which is not how they're split up in the reading, but it might be how I split them up in the lecture, because I might actually record the lectures this weekend at home. So I might have the lectures posted come Monday. Hopefully I'll have them at least no later than Tuesday of next week. I do apologize, the lectures have been a little late for the class. The reason for that is simply because this is the first time I'm teaching this class online. So the lectures, I'm recording them fresh, and sometimes when you get a fresh lecture, you may have to wait a little bit longer for it depending on how my Monday and my Tuesday go. So bigger lectures coming next week covering both weeks of readings. I'll also probably have a regular lecture just kind of covering course materials, things along those lines, or it'll be built into one of those two lectures. All right, so if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, go ahead and get to work on your poetry bundle that's due Sunday. Start thinking about your poetry analysis paper and work on your cinquain and critiquing the ekphrasis poem. All right, take care, be well, and I will talk to you folks again in about 7 days.